George Miller watched his dog Crosby stare at one of the walls of their home, day in and day out. Finally, he decided to install a camera, thinking he'd spot what Crosby was so interested in. After checking over some of the tape footage, George went to the wall, much to Crosby's delight. What the young man found was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. It was the answer to all of his questions. Living in a different city from the rest of your family can get lonely. For bachelor George Miller, that loneliness was a bit of a challenge. He was used to having a support team around him at all times, so he decided to do something about it and get a companion. But this companion didn't come in the form of a human partner. George was thinking of something with 4 legs and not 2. The 29-year-old was getting a bit lonely in this new city. So to make himself feel a bit more at home, away from his family, George Miller decided to adopt a dog. Crosby was loving, loyal, and just what George needed in his new city. While Crosby was most certainly man's best friend, there was something about George's fuzzy friend that he was about to find out. And trust us, it's something unexpected. It took George Miller a while to figure out what his dog was doing exactly. He'd never seen Crosby do something like this after all, and George had adopted him a few years back. For all George knew, Crosby was a typical loving, goofy dog who loved people and making friends with other animals at the park. But now, everything was changing and George didn't really know what to do or feel about the situation. If one thing's for sure, it doesn't take much for Crosby to befriend other animals. The next-door neighbor's dog and cat were pretty much Crosby's best friends, always playing and getting into antics with one another. Unfortunately, Crosby's 2 best fur friends passed away one after the other. While their owner was obviously heartbroken, they weren't the only one. Crosby was devastated over the loss of his 2 friends. What was George going to do now? Like humans, pets strive for companionship. That's why they're typically extremely loyal to their humans and want nothing more than to be around them at all times. The same goes for their friends. When they lose a close buddy, they feel a sense of loss and sadness, similar to a person losing someone they love. After losing the neighbor, cat, and dog, it makes sense that Crosby would be a little unhappy. But that wasn't the reason for his unusual behavior. George Miller and Crosby had been together for a few years and stuck to a daily routine of walks, feeding, more walks, and, of course, playtime. He didn't really notice anything out of the ordinary at first. That is, until he came home one day expecting Crosby to meet him with kisses at the door, and he wasn't there. Instead, George's pooch was doing something a bit strange and out of the ordinary, something George couldn't explain. George Miller was expecting Crosby to meet him at the door when he returned home. It's what the pooch typically did, after all. But this day was different. Something had caught Crosby's attention to the point of him not answering when George called his name. After calling out to the dog multiple times, George decided to see what has gotten his friend's attention. It must be very interesting for Crosby not to run to the door. After calling Crosby's name a few times, George Miller decided to get down to his dog's level and see what was interesting him so much. As it turned out, it was the living room wall. Crosby was staring so intently at the wall, it was as if nothing else existed around him, including his owner. George was a bit confused because there wasn't anything unusual about the living room wall, at least to his human senses. Kneeling down to Crosby's level, George Miller didn't see anything wrong with the living room wall. So why was Crosby so interested in it, and what caught the dog's attention in the first place? Like any good pet owner, George was concerned for his fuzzy companion. Crosby was typically a fun-loving pooch, but whatever was wrong with the wall had him very paranoid. What exactly was causing that paranoia was a total mystery, though. In an attempt to calm Crosby down, George touched him, saying, "What is it, boy?" Petting him was the only time Crosby snapped out of his staring contest with the wall. Otherwise, his eyes were pinned to the paint, looking at some unknown object. George was just happy to see there wasn't actually anything wrong with his dog. At first, he thought Crosby's hearing was going. Now, he realized Crosby was transfixed on the living room wall. Was it a bug George wasn't seeing? As much as George hoped and wished Crosby wasn't staring at a bug on the wall, it turned out to be something much bigger than a creepy crawly that had happened to make its way into the house. Even so, after a while, Crosby returned to normal. He left the wall behind, ate some dinner, and snuggled with his owner. Later that evening, though, George woke up to something a bit unsettling. In the middle of the night, George Miller woke up needing a glass of water. On his way to the kitchen, though, the last thing he expected to see was Crosby once again staring at the living room wall. It was pitch dark. What in the world was the dog looking at, and why couldn't George see it? Unlike an hour earlier, Crosby seemed a bit different, almost as if the dog was sadder. The next day, George Miller decided he would figure out why his dog was staring at the living room wall. Before work, he decided to go out and buy a night vision camera, setting it up in his living room in hopes of spotting what Crosby was looking at. But he didn't look at the footage right away. George wanted at least 2 days' worth of evidence to help him figure out what was going on with his dog. To George Miller's surprise, the footage didn't show Crosby looking at the living room wall. It turned out that he really only did that when George was around, adding yet another mystery to this whole experience. It was almost as if Crosby was trying to tell George something about the wall, but had no way to communicate with him other than staring. Well, the staring definitely caught George's attention. He just had no idea what it meant. Crosby might not speak English, but he was definitely trying to signal something to George Miller. Barking, scratching, and jumping around might be the go-to forms of communication for most dogs. Crosby was sticking to staring. Now, it was a matter of figuring out why he was staring and what he was trying to say to George. Was he completely missing something, or was Crosby trying to tell him something important? George Miller was stumped. He had no clue why Crosby was staring at the living room wall. Still, he went into the room and took another look, thinking he was missing something. Something unexpected happened when he walked into the room, though. Crosby started playfully barking, following George into the living room. It was the most energetic and happy George had seen his pooch since the neighbor's cat and dog had passed away. Egged on by his barking dog, George Miller got down on his hands and knees to further inspect the wall. That's when Crosby started barking more. It was like an odd game of hot or cold. Only one of the players couldn't exactly speak English, and the other had no clue if a bark meant hot or cold. George soon found out why Crosby was so intent on staring at the wall, though. After further inspection of the wall, George Miller heard an odd sound. It didn't take long for him to realize the sound was coming from inside the wall. This must have been the reason why Crosby had been staring at it for so many days. Now the question was, what on earth could possibly be stuck in the wall? And how was he supposed to get it, whatever it was, out? His heart was pounding with the realization. Finally, George Miller was getting somewhere. There was definitely something in his living room wall, and that was why Crosby's been staring at it. Now, it was a matter of finding a way to get whatever it was out. After looking more closely at the wall, George noticed some wood paneling had become loose near the floor. He removed it, noticing a hole in the drywall. Coming this far, he decided to go all in, sticking his hand into the hole. After finding the hole in the wall, George decided he had to find out as much as he could. So obviously, that meant sticking his hand into the hole and maneuvering it all the way up to his elbow. Moving his hands around the inside of the wall, George's eyes widened in disbelief. What on earth was he feeling? Was something living in his living room wall? He closed his fist around as much debris as he could and brought it out of the wall. George Miller felt around the inside of the wall for a bit before realizing there was much more than just dust and drywall particles on the ground. With as much care as possible, George closed his fist around the debris and pulled it from the wall. Opening his fist, he was confused when he saw drywall, dust, insulation, and dirt. There had to be something else inside of the wall. That's when he heard the cries. George Miller knew he was close to figuring out why Crosby was staring at the wall when the cries began. Hearing the first one, George flung his arm back into the hole, hoping for a better outcome the second time around. With as much force as he could, George stretched his arm further down the hole. That's when he felt something small and soft. Considering what his findings were the first time around, he didn't think it was anything more than insulation. Boy, was he wrong. George Miller thought the small and soft object was nothing more than insulation. That is, until he heard a small whine. That sound was definitely not coming from insulation. George closed his hand around the creature, then with great care and tried to wiggle it out of the wall. Of course, this is easier said than done, and the creature didn't exactly take to a strange and large creature, taking it from its home. Finally, George Miller was able to get the creature out of the wall. To his utmost surprise, it turned out to be a tiny kitten. How in the world did it end up in the paneling between his living room and washroom? Even weirder, the kitten looked strangely like Crosby's late feline friend from next door. Did his dog have something to do with this kitten's lodging in the wall? George Miller couldn't believe a tiny kitten was living in his wall all this time. The poor thing was covered in dust. Who knew how long it had been living there? One thing was for certain, though. George needed a plan of action. Was the neighbor's cat its mother? Or was another cat wondering where its baby is? George knew one thing. This kitten didn't find its way inside the wall by itself. Crosby must have helped. First things first, George Miller wanted to clean the tiny kitten up. Using a damp cloth, he washed the kitten of dust. But that pretty much ended his knowledge of how to take care of a kitten that must be no more than a few weeks old. While George was racking his brain on what his next move should be, Crosby was wagging his tail, overjoyed by the tiny creature his owner was holding. Crosby might have been excited about the house guest, but George Miller had no clue how to take care of a kitten. He hoped its owner lived nearby, so George went ahead and started asking around his neighbors if anyone was looking for a lost kitten. While no one claimed the tiny creature as their own, the neighbors were saying the kitten looked familiar. She must be a stray, meaning a veterinarian visit was in order. George Miller brought the kitten to the veterinarian for a checkup. Thankfully, aside from being hungry and dirty, nothing was wrong with the creature. Unfortunately, she didn't have a chip either, so there was no way for George to find its owner. And with no one responding to his lost kitten posters and Facebook pages, George was at a loss. The time was coming where he was going to have to make a tough decision. With no one coming forward to claim the kitten, George Miller was going to have to make a tough decision. Crosby was obviously thrilled with the tiny creature, turning back into his joyful and happy self after his two fur friends' deaths. But George didn't want a kitten. He talked to the veterinarian about other options, such as a shelter. It crushed him, but he wanted to make sure the kitten was in good hands. The vet was real with George, telling him that the kitten was likely to be put down if he was brought to a shelter. During an interview, George said, "The vet basically told me that if I took her to the shelter, she'd be put down because there are already over 300 kittens at the county shelter alone that need homes." He said, "I could try putting her outside and hope she goes home, or I could keep her." After hearing that bit of information, it didn't take long for George to decide to keep the kitten. Crosby already seemed to take a liking to the tiny creature anyway, so he took the kitten home. Right away, George could see Crosby was overjoyed. He was going to have an animal companion in the house. Not to mention the kitten now had a loving home and brother to play with. It was a win-win. George decided to name the kitten Lil Ray Ray and made a vow to pay a bit more attention to Crosby when he does something out of the ordinary, like, say, staring at a wall for longer than necessary. And even though he didn't really want a kitten, George knew he made the right choice. Crosby and Lil Ray Ray were like each other's long-lost soulmates, becoming instant friends, partners in crime, and of course, napping buddies.